I'd like to welcome you to the afternoon session of the 35th Annual Marion Thompson Wright Lecture Series in memory of Dr. Clement Price. My name is Jenna Dublin, and I'm a Rutgers University alumni and former student of Dr. Price. And I just want to say that he was a great teacher and mentor to me as both an undergraduate and a graduate student. And I'm so very grateful for all of his support and his belief in me, which is one of the very reasons why I'm able to introduce such amazing speakers this afternoon. I thank dearly to Dr. Price for this opportunity, and I also just want to note that the speakers of this afternoon are people who've really shaped my own studies and my own life, so I'm very grateful for them as well. So I'd like to take a moment to thank our morning speakers who gave such inspiring presentations. And for the afternoon session, we're going to begin with remarks from the Honorable Kim Guadagno, then go on to the presentation of the Mildred Garvin Prize, also the Clement Price Essay Contest for Newark Public Schools, and then I will introduce our two afternoon speakers. We will close with remarks from Dr. Marion Petty of Northwestern University, and please join us afterwards at the Newark Museum for a reception and special tribute to Dr. Price, which is free and open to all. So from its very beginning, the Marion Thompson Wright Lecture Series has been steadily supported and co-sponsored by the New Jersey Historical Commission. That support and partnership has been invaluable to the success of the series, and the personal friendships at the Institute of Ethnicity, Culture, and Modern Experience has forged with Commission's members and staff have made it all the more enjoyable. And as many of you know, the Commission falls under the Department of State, and so we are very, very happy to have with us today for her second time at the Marion Thompson Wright Lecture, New Jersey Secretary of State and First Lieutenant Governor. Please join us in welcoming the Honorable Kim Guadagno.
Now, everybody give Jenna a hand, because that takes a lot of guts, don't you think? And for those of you who haven't yet looked in your catalog or your program, you have to look at her resume. I mean, I'm 55 years old. I should have something to talk about. But Jenna, I don't know how old you are, but you have a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Maryland. You have a BA from Rutgers-Newark, where I have taught for 8 years in law school anyway, in African American history and African studies. You have a BFA from Cooper Union School of Art. Yeah, see, read your program. This is amazing. So wait a minute. Following graduation from Cooper's Union, she pursued work in museums, including Museum of Contemporary Art, African Diasporan. See, now you need to I'll teach you how to say my last name if you teach me what this means. At least I admit what I cannot deny, and that is I don't know what that is, but I do know the Guggenheim Museums, and I bet you all do too. While attending the University of Maryland, you interned with the National Trust for Historic Preservation as a Mildred Scholar and the National Park Service, where you concentrated on diversity in federal historic preservation and its policies. That deserves a round of applause. She's one of Newark's own. That was fabulous. Congratulations. It's a pleasure to be here at the 35th anniversary of the Marion Thompson Wright Lecture Series, and I promise I will keep it short because you have a fabulous program scheduled for the rest of the afternoon. I don't need to tell anyone in this room that February marks a special time to reflect on the extraordinary achievements of the African American community itself, whether it be in business or industry, government, education, or elsewhere. It is, in fact, the most important part of our history here in New Jersey, and it's incredibly important that we remember, not only for ourselves, but for our children. We are reminded of the great progress we've made here in New Jersey. New Jersey has been and is home to many well-known African Americans whose achievements we celebrate throughout this entire month. One reason that's one reason that the history of African Americanism here in New Jersey, that's one reason why we are the first state to have officially recognized the Martin Luther King's birthday, and with the Martin Luther King Commission, which was established by Governor Tom Kean in 1983. We have a lot of history here, but today, Today, I'm privileged to stand before you to say a few words to honor the great African-American leader, this event's co-founder, Dr. Clement Alexander Price, and I'd like to recognize his wife, who I'm sure has already been recognized several times in this room here today. I have no doubt that our sorrow today at his loss is matched only by our appreciation of having known him at all. Raise your hand if you knew Dr. Price. All right. So I am singing to the choir. Let that be a lesson to me. New Jersey and New Jersey's history of arts, culture, and a fabulous cultural community will never be forgotten. And that's mostly due to Dr. Price's dedication to excellence in scholarship and his long career promoting creativity and multicultural understanding. Anyone who has had an opportunity, as I did this past week, to see Thelma doesn't need to be reinvigorated by the hope and the promise that Dr. Price provided to us. We remember him not only as a historian whose immeasurable contributions to the discussion and understanding of African American history cannot be overstated. We will never, ever let it be forgotten. Dr. Price, as you all well know, moved to Newark after the Newark riots, and where others saw bleakness, he saw and promoted opportunity. Where others fled the city, he stayed and made it his own. This city rewards people who dig in and try to contribute to the general public good, he told a reporter in 2008. Regard for Dr. Price during his lifetime was not confined to Newark or to New Jersey or to scholars. No, although I believe that would have been enough. No, he was seen not only as a social philosopher, but as a person who believed in things on a national level. He believed if you want to change things, you have to lead that change and live that change. No doubt that's why President-elect Barack Obama recognized him as a force, recognized him as a leader for change, which is why he asked Dr. Price to lead his National Endowment for the Humanities transition team. As President Obama would turn to him again, appointing Dr. Price to serve as a vice chairman of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Today, we share our gratitude for his life and his work. With his fierce advocacy for the adoptive city he loves, Dr. Price helped us, me, and others like me, to understand how the events of Newark, fraught and sometimes frightful, shaped and continues to shape the present-day Newark and the present-day New Jersey. We turn to him often as Newark's official historian for the sustained optimism that infused his hopes for the city's future, and for the future of our state. We miss and will continue to miss that steadfastness, that confidence. In light of the current strife in Newark and elsewhere, I had a chance to talk to a teacher on the way in, and I'm glad she took that opportunity, and I gave her my cell phone number because we are all committed to the education of our children. As a mother of 3 and one who taught here in Newark for 8 years in night school, at the law school, we need to have an open and honest discussion. That's a discussion that Dr. Price would have invited and welcomed and embraced. But everyone, I suspect, needs to be at the table. I suspect that Dr. Price would have invited everyone to be at the table in a conversation that the fundamentals of which we all agree upon. The fundamentals of which we all agree upon. For some, current events must seem to embody the aspects of our past more than hope for our future. But I hope as you leave this conference today, you take what we learned not only from Black History Month, but from everything Dr. Price wanted us to do and wanted us to know and wanted us to embrace. I hope we walk away with that with a new hope. And that's why we will so miss the arc of Dr. Price's influence, his wise enthusiasm, and an enthusiasm that embraced change, embraced the debate, and how hard he worked for it. And even in his absence, we know that he continues to inspire us, at least I hope he does. That's what today is about. His work continues to foster educational, artistic, and cultural renaissance, not just in Newark, not just in the city of Newark, but in the state, not just today, not just this year, but for years and decades to come. Looking across this room, I have the utmost confidence in all of you that we together will be able to continue to honor the spirit and the legacy of Dr. Price and leaders like Dr. Price and Dr. King and the many others who have gone before us and the many others that will come next. I hope we all share a vision of what Dr. Price saw, and that is a united world with everyone having a voice at the table. Thank you so very much for having me today, and congratulations on the success of this conference.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Larry Greene of the History Department at Seton Hall University. He's a member of the Marion Thompson Wright Study Club and the New Jersey Historical Commission. Professor Greene will present this year's Mildred Barry Garvin Prize on behalf of the Commission and in recognition of outstanding teaching in African American history in kindergarten through high school classrooms. Please welcome Professor Larry Greene.
Welcome, and thank you very much for the honor of introducing the Mildred Barry Garvin Prize winner this afternoon. Thank you to Mark and the Institute staff for once again organizing such a wonderful MTW conference. It just seems like a few years ago, if that long, that Clem, Giles, myself, and others were sitting around talking about honoring teachers who have done so much to promote African American history and the need to continue that. And it is out of those discussions many years ago, my memory's getting short with age, that the Mildred Barry Garvin Prize came into fruition. However, I would like to make an announcement that the New Jersey Historical Commission is accepting nominations for the Mildred Barry Garvin Prize. Nominations are due May 1st, 2015. That is the deadline. The prize is named in honor, of course, of Mildred Barry Garvin, who served as the 27th Assembly District Assemblywoman in Essex County from 1978 to 1988. She was a graduate of the Rutgers School of Administration here in Newark, and in honor of her contribution to the state politics and education, the Mildred Barry Garvin Prize was awarded by the New Jersey Historical Commission for the first time in 1995. The prize carries an award of $1,500 to a New Jersey teacher, guidance counselor, or school librarian for outstanding teaching of Black American history at any grade level between kindergarten and high school. It is awarded to individuals demonstrating outstanding performance in related activities, such as developing curriculum materials. So please, if you know of any outstanding teachers that have touched your lives or the lives of your children, please nominate them and contact the New Jersey Historical Commission at their website, and you can also self-nominate. Today, our prize winner is Ms. Virginia D'Antonio. And yes, please. Dr. Price took the selection of the Mildred Barry Garvin Prize winner very seriously. We all felt that we personally, and many people nationally, first fell in love with history because of an outstanding teacher who made history come alive for us. It is particularly important for educators to include African American history into the American narrative, as we have heard this morning. For it is in those early years that students begin to form a sense of identity of who they are and their proper place in the American story. Black History Month and throughout the year came alive under Miss D'Antonio's teaching and tutorials for her eighth grade students. From her promotional t-shirts with African American history makers to curricular concerns and teaching materials, covering the antebellum experience through the civil rights struggles, she has spoken to her own eighth grade students and school at Abington Avenue School here in Newark. Ms. D'Antonio has promoted and instilled the African American historical experience in her students. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Ms. Virginia D'Antonio. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to show you the award. And thank you so much, and continued success.
Congratulations. So this is the first year of the Clement Price Essay Contest for Newark Public Schools, done as remembrance to Dr. Price and the impact of his work on all facets of society, including young students. The Newark Public Schools, as tribute to him, collaborated with the Institute to create this contest. So to announce the winners, I'd like to ask to join me on the stage, Lieutenant Governor Mark Kosovic, Shania Hamilton, and Nishia Smith. I'd also like to invite to the stage two of the contest judges, Dr. England and Dr. Bosch. So I'd like to announce the winners, beginning with honorable mention, which goes to Tony Ferrado of Oliver Street School. Third place prize goes to Gabriela Lopez. Second place goes to Natalie Fernandez. And first place goes to Christine Matias. And I'd also like to ask to join the stage one of the principals, Mr. Gregory, if he's here.
Just wanted to take 1 minute to thank Rutgers University and the Institute for allowing Newark Public Schools to be a partner in the event today. I'm sure most of the folks in this room today were also at Dr. Price's funeral and will recall Reverend Howard asking individuals to take an active step in supporting the Institute and the history of the Institute. Well, many of you know Newark Public Schools doesn't have a lot of money, but we were very, very pleased to be able to collaborate to bring the words of our students to this forum, and just want to give thanks to everyone who made that happen. So thank you, and a round of applause for the students.
Congratulations again to all the students. That's really fantastic. So we have an amazing set of speakers for this afternoon, some of my own personal heroes in the visual arts and historic preservation. So it is an honor to introduce our first afternoon speaker, Thelma Golden. She is director and chief curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem, an art museum founded in 1968 in New York City's ever-evolving neighborhood of African-American creativity and intellectual life. The studio's mission is to serve as a nexus for artists of African descent around the world who continue to redefine notions of Blackness. Ms. Golden holds a BA in Art History and African American Studies from Smith College and honorary doctorates from the City College of New York, the San Francisco Art Institute, Smith College, and the Moore College of Art and Design. She serves as a member of the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, a position to which she was appointed by President Barack Obama in 2010. She also serves as the Manhattan Vice Chair of the Cultural Institutions Group, and she's a member of the Professional Fine Arts Committee of the Foundation for Art and Preservation in Embassies. Golden began her career at the Studio Museum in 1987 before joining the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1988. She then returned to the Studio Museum in 2000 and was soon named director and chief curator. While at the Studio Museum, Golden has organized groundbreaking exhibitions including Chris O'Feely, Afro Muses, Freestyle, and Gordon Parks' A Harlem Family, 1967. Under her leadership, the Studio Museum has gained recognition as a global leader in the exhibition of contemporary art, a center for innovative education, and a site for diverse audiences to exchange ideas about art and society. Please welcome Thelma Golden.
Thank you, Jenna. Good afternoon. It is fantastic to be here today with you all on this amazing occasion. I want to thank Chancellor Cantor. To be here on your campus is a great honor. I want to thank Mark Kresovic and the entire Institute staff for making this possible. When Dr. Price asked me to do this, well, he didn't really ask me, he told me. Be clear? He told me he was going to do this, and he said that the theme being Curating Black America, and the idea was, of course, that we would hear from my dear colleague, Lonnie Bunch, about his amazing project in Washington, but that he wanted the conversation to include art and art museums. And I know that's because he deeply understood what innovative, inspiring museum work means, and that's because of my colleague, Mary Sue Sweeney Price, who I want to honor today in my being here. You know, when thinking about this idea of curating Black America, I can only come to this conversation by speaking as a curator. I am and have always been a curator of contemporary art, and my work has been informed deeply by the idea that the work of Black artists for me has formed the base from which I have worked for over 25 years. Now, to talk about my work in this moment, I'm just getting my technology going, really means starting in some ways from my very beginning. And I was very lucky, as we just saw those amazing students, to be influenced very early in my career. My sense that I would be a curator came very early in my life, when I was 12 or 13 years old, through the intervention of an amazing teacher, Lucille Buck, who taught me art history in those years. But more importantly than teaching me art history, she allowed me to understand museums as really amazing, engaged places. And so it is with that that I went to college, to Smith College, as was said, and I know one of my Smith sisters is here in the room. Where are you, Dale? Let's represent. There we are. I went to Smith College, and I, in the late 80s, was an art history and an African American studies major. Two amazing places, two amazing departments to study in. The challenge there, however, is that there was no art history in African American studies in that moment, and there were no Black artists in the art history I was being taught. So it is from that moment in 1985, when I got an internship at the Studio Museum in Harlem, that I understood that for me, curating was going to bring those two things together. Now, of course, that was a path that I was charting that had been charted by many people before me, but very specifically at the Studio Museum, it was the director at the time, Dr. Mary Schmidt-Campbell, an amazing art historian who took the Studio Museum from its founding moments in the late 60s, early 70s into the 80s, and gave me not just a home, but an intellectual path to chart. This is a work by Romare Bearden. To talk about the Studio Museum is really to talk about, this idea of what it means to create these places that celebrate and understand the culture. The museum's original mandate, which remains, was to be an institution devoted to the presentation, collection, interpretation of work by Black artists. It was seemingly, with the title studio at the head of our name, also a place to celebrate and support the work of living artists, to create in a museum an institution that was deeply committed not just to the product of art, the object, but to the process. The original space, which you're seeing an image of there on Fifth Avenue between 125th Street and 126th Street. This slide does not show you, but actually the museum was on the second floor. The first floor was a liquor store. I've edited out that little part, so our original facade. But that original space had the ambition to really redefine what it meant to be a museum, what it meant to be a museum in a community like Harlem. It was with great ambition and the vision of the architect J. Max Bond that we moved into our first building in 1979, an adaptive reuse of a 1906 bank building that had been vacant for many years through the 60s before being reborn as the Studio Museum. And it really was also an institution that was defining itself completely by sight. Now, often when I'm in the world, I sort of talk about Harlem being the center of a kind of Black culture. I know in Newark I have to be very careful before I claim all sort of presence of Harlem's, singularity around being an innovative cultural space. So what I will say is, Harlem, I know, look. So what I will say is that it was a museum that really wanted to draw on the incredible history of the community of Harlem, the history that was sort of made through the understanding of it as a home for a Black sensibility. It is the Harlem of the past with which the museum was sort of building itself, the ground on which the museum first created itself, but it really was a Harlem also of that present, a Harlem that needed a sense of hope, a sense of possibility, a sense that art and culture could be part of engaged community redevelopment that really made the museum happen. I talk about this history of the museum because it also is tied to my own history. And so probably how and why I became a curator, yes, was academic, but also how I've ended up at the Studio Museum in Harlem as a curator also was somewhat personal. And that is probably because my father, who is now 89, was born in Harlem in 1926. So Harlem is a community that I understood intimately because of its past, because that past was living in him. And growing up as I did in Southeast Queens, whenever we took the bridge across to Manhattan, my father did not see the abandoned buildings and empty sort of street corners that were the Harlem of that moment. He saw the Harlem of his youth, the Harlem in some of these pictures, which was a vibrant community completely defined by Black culture and the Black culture that nurtured him. In thinking about this idea of curating, however, it really does sort of speak to curating not as a neutral act. Now, Mark, of course, spoke to something that many of us who are curators are deeply concerned with, and that is the idea that everybody is a curator now, right? That everyone curates everything, and it, in some ways, has taken away some specificity from that word. For those of us who actually do it, it probably isn't as troubling as it might seem, but it does bring back the idea of what the act really is about, the idea of a kind of discernment, of creating narratives out of objects, of creating narratives in space, right, around art and objects in ways that create understanding. And the Studio Museum very much saw itself as not simply an art museum, but as an institution that would shift and change the dialogue of how we understood art and artists. This is early, fantastic photographs. We've been doing some, we have to get rid of some of our storage space, so it's meaning that I'm going through boxes, and I've been doing this for 2 years, this sort of inevitability of, boxes and boxes and rooms with no labels on them, that, I just open up things and keep finding these fantastic photographs from our early days, which we are now digitizing so that they will be available to tell the story of the Studio Museum, which will celebrate its 50th anniversary in 2019. But as I say, the story of this museum is one of art and artists. It's also one of culture. It's one of the culture as it's defined through the creative visionaries. Hear the words, of course, of your native son, Amiri Baraka, but about my home, Harlem. In thinking about curating Black America from an art perspective, to curate art means that you are working with artists, you're working for artists, you're working with objects, and for creating a space in which objects can speak. And no place better, I think, has this been done with art and through the early history of the Studio Museum in Harlem, which really brought together the idea of art and history. An early example, of course, was a 1987 exhibition curated by Mary Schmidt-Campbell called Tradition and Conflict, Images of a Turbulent Decade, 1963 to 1973. In this groundbreaking exhibition, what Dr. Campbell did was create an exhibition which looked at the civil rights movement, of course, but looked at it through the work of artists. So looked at the way in which history could be told through the works of artists. This is David Hammond's 1970 work, Injustice Case. This exhibition, which was one of many which characterized the museum's first 2 decades, where engaged scholarship was met by innovative conceptual art by artists, really is what defined for me the space of what engaged curatorial practice can and should be. This is Gordon Parks, Eldridge Cleaver, and his wife Kathleen in exile in Algiers from 1980. And of course, Monita Sleets, Mrs. Coretta King, and daughter Bernice at the funeral of her husband in 1968. This is an exhibition that combined art and artifact. It combined words and images to create a sense of understanding that was through the works of art themselves. It was about a historic dialogue that was driven by artists and their vision, and looking at artists as visual storytellers, tellers of the narrative of their time through their eyes, through their artwork. This influenced greatly the work that I did when I became a curator at the Whitney Museum in 1988, and then stayed there until 1998. In 1994, in seeking to understand how art and culture could be understood through the work of living artists, I made an exhibition called Blackmail: Representations of Masculinity in Contemporary American Art. Now, in 1994, newly a curator at the Whitney Museum, I was most interested in both looking at the work that had been done by pioneering curators, names like people like Dr. David Driscoll, Dr. Lowry Stokes Sims, Dr. Leslie King Hammond, Mary Schmidt-Campbell, of course, director of the Studio Museum, but also looking very much to artists to understand what the space of investigation could be. In a museum space, particularly a museum like the Whitney. I was the first African-American curator at the Whitney and given a huge amount of autonomy to shape a dialogue there which looked through the lens of American art at artists of all races who were making work about Black masculinity. Now, what was interesting about, there were many things interesting about this exhibition, and it's very hard for me to acknowledge, as I stand here today, that this exhibition happened 20 years ago. Because it both doesn't feel possible that I've been working for 20 years, and certainly doesn't feel possible that I'm 20 years older. But taking both of those things into account and thinking about the moment in which this exhibition was made, the moment that was sort of bracketed by this sort of O.J. Simpson case happening on one hand, and what was sort of a really critical moment in hip-hop culture happening on the other. This was the year in which it felt as if the convergence of an idea of Black masculinity was in the public view. Now, of course, as I stand here and talk about the show as I have for the last couple of months, it also is this moment now. So it's also about an exhibition making that seeks to, in its moment, speak about the moment, but also create a ground from which we understand how we can see from the past and in the future, through art, ways to fully begin to investigate our current times. Blackmail, for me, was the beginning of an exploration which has continued through the rest of my career, but perhaps a very specific one, because it also was my commitment to working with living artists, and working with artists whose work was primarily formed and understood through their presentation of ideas in that work. This is a work by Andre Serrano and portraits by Barclay Hendricks. Black Male sought through 28 artists to examine the ways in which Black masculinity had been looked at in popular culture and through the media, and more specifically, the ways in which artists had used these representations as a way to critique popular culture and media culture for the overwhelming way in which stereotypes form ideas and ideals. It was a complicated exhibition because, of course, it meant as a curator that I was entering into dialogues that weren't just dialogues about art, but it was rewarding because those dialogues were so deeply informative for me as a way to think about how fully I could exist in contemporary dialogues as someone invested in art and artworks. It's a work by Tim Rollins and KOS, an homage to Malcolm X. And if I weren't here with you all today, I'd be in Harlem, where there are many different celebrations today, of course, marking the day of, commemoration of his assassination. One of the things that was most specifically profound for me in the space of the exhibition, Black Male, was the way in which it brought me into a conversation about how we understand ownership of images. While this exhibition was on view, we had at the time a talk radio station in New York City, sadly no longer, African-American talk radio station, and my father listened to it every day in his office, he and his team. My father was a lawyer and an insurance broker. And in the office they listened, and when the show opened at the Whitney, it received a huge amount of dialogue. Other people call it controversy. I like to just think of it as dialogue. And on this call-in radio station, every day people were calling in to absolutely go berserk about their feelings about the exhibition. And in particular, there was a lot of concern about the fact that this exhibition at the Whitney Museum on Madison Avenue, on the Upper East Side, was curated by Thelma Golden, who was a middle-aged Jewish woman. Now, this is what was being said, right, on the radio. My father, an African-American man, was very upset about this, and so he wanted to call in. Now, this is my father, whose name is Artie Golden. Wanted to call in to correct this, right? To say, you all have to stop, talking about Thelma Golden, she's my daughter. He had a long thing he was going to say. And I had to continually pull him back from this through the space of the exhibition. But essentially, what came out of that was the fact that the issue was about who has the right to speak about these images, which artists. And this work that I'm showing you by Leon Golub was a real touchstone, because at that point, being in the museum one day, a woman walked up to me and she said to me, "You're Thelma Golden?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "I came to this exhibition because I heard that the Whitney Museum had all of these very stereotypical images of Black men." And she expressed her concern about this. She expressed how this was not the way in which she felt we should be represented, and she felt that I needed to take responsibility for that the curatorial act was one of responsibility, and I need to take responsibility. And then she pointed to this work, and she expressed to me how much it moved her, how the portrait of these four men reminded her of the men that she grew up with, her father, her brother, her uncles, men in her neighborhood. She was pleased to see that they were portrayed in a moment of leisure, which she felt was within the context of their space. She was amazed by the fact that the artist sort of captured them, that while not fully figuratively, that the painting reveals so much emotion in it. And she expressed to me that this, to her, was the example of amazing work made by Black artists about ourselves. And I didn't know what to do. Right? Because I'd already gone through the Thelma Golden issue. So I thought, I'm not sure how I'm going to have this conversation, and explain to her that this work was by Leon Golub, who at the time was alive in his 80s, and a white artist who made this work so full of dignity and sensitivity, who made this work that spoke to her so deeply. And we had an amazing conversation, but I walked away from that, not just with the gift of her giving me the space in which to discuss this, but the gift of understanding the power of the space of art to have those kinds of conversations. It influenced my work ever since. But then fast forward, I end up, after 10 years at the Whitney, in Harlem, back at the Studio Museum where I'd interned as a college student in 1985, back now as the chief curator and deputy director to Dr. Lowry Stokes Sims, a real heroine to me, the first African-American curator at the Metropolitan Museum, whose specialty was modern and contemporary art, also from Queens, which was, of course, also very special to me, and Lowry hired me as her chief curator. And in that space, I began to see that my responsibility was to think about this idea of not just curating, but cultural specificity. What did it mean in the year 2000, the dawn of the new millennium, to have a museum devoted to Black artists, to Black ideas in Harlem, a rapidly changing community? And so much of what those first few years felt like was a reckoning with this fact, and a reckoning that came really, that can be described through what I refer to pretty consistently as the sort of prepositional problem. And that is, the Studio Museum in Harlem's name is the Studio Museum in Harlem. And more often than not, people say the Studio Museum of Harlem. And it's a complicated issue, right? Because you never know if you should correct someone. Does that seem nitpicky? Or should you just let it go, but then it's not quite our real name? You know, it sort of feels like a person who always has to engage people in how to pronounce their name, right? That you sort of are always wondering. But for me, this sort of Studio Museum in Harlem, Studio Museum of Harlem, this sort of prepositional problematic, the in or the of, really became the space in which I found that we could do our most profound work, understanding the in Harlem and the of Harlem, in that moment, in the very rapidly changing Harlem. To do this, it meant really considering what it would mean to think about curating from this very specific place, from Harlem, from the Studio Museum, but from a very specific intellectual place, the one in which many artists were operating, a place in which perhaps there wasn't a deep understanding yet of a way to characterize Black art in one way. And could the museum be the place that could take on the sort of multiple ways in which Black artists could make work and be understood? Could we open up the debates as opposed to shut them down? Could we take perhaps a different position than museums often do and sit behind authority and allow for perhaps a little contradiction, right, to be within the space? To do that, I made a series of exhibitions, but just talk about two of them today as a way to sort of maybe understand where, again, the possibilities are for an engaged curatorial practice. The first is an exhibition that I curated in 2004 called Black Romantic. This is a work by Kadir Nelson, a painting of his called Africa, which then got reprised somewhat on the cover of the latest Drake album. Anyone knows that. Kadir also, who did this week's, one of the 90th anniversary covers of The New Yorker. And I set out to do Black Romantic for a couple of reasons. One was to try and understand this idea that when often one is engaged in cultural specificity, the terms of the argument are the sort of mainstream and the margin, the inside, the outside, right? So that very much, the engaged work that the Studio Museum did in the 70s and the 80s was about changing the canon of art history. It was about rewriting the art history to include Black artists. It was about reimagining the idea that a global contemporary art world could not understand itself without understanding the contributions of Black artists. And that incredible important work had really changed the terms of the debate. This exhibition, Black Romantic, for me, was about what are the debates within the community, right? What happens when we sort of close the door on the fights that might happen around this idea of what the greater canon is, what happens when we investigate our own? It essentially was an exhibition also about taste. I had had the occasion many times where people know that I am a curator. And it's funny about, how curators overused now. This is an aside. But, I can remember being in college in the late 80s and saying I want to be a curator. And the only popular culture reference to curating was Whitley on the show A Different World. If anyone remembers A Different World, Whitley was a curator. So if I said to people, oh, I want to be a curator, they'd say, like Whitley. Whereas now you say you're a curator and people say, what do you curate? And I want to say to them, well, the only thing you really can curate is art, but I don't get into that, right? Because then, then I sound like, too antagonistic about it. But, so one reason for this exhibition was to, understand what the role of a curator is. I have had the privilege of working in amazing museums, two amazing museums, the Studio Museum in Harlem and the Whitney Museum. And in that role, curating involves an authority. And inherent to that authority is defining of tastes, right? You make decisions, you put works on the walls, and that, on the walls of the museum, gives them authority and power. I wanted to understand what it would be if I gave that up. What would happen if I made a show in which I was not necessarily making choices in that way? The second reason I made the exhibition is because I had many, many, many occasions where people, knowing I was a curator, would say to me, "Oh, my mother, sister, brother has a work of art, and we'd like you to come see it. We think it's a masterpiece," or they're hoping it's a masterpiece. And I would inevitably go see it, and it would be horrible. But there's nothing you can say to that. I mean, there's nothing that would make it possible, because it's not horrible to them, but it would be horrible to me. That would be me acknowledging, my taste in that way. In that, however, in that process, I was intrigued and interested, though, in that space. The third reason I did this exhibition, quite honestly, is for my mother. My mother, again, I very lucky, two amazing, amazing parents. My mother made me everything that I am. She was my biggest cheerleader, so completely committed to my professional and personal growth that she would never have admitted it fully, but it was very clear to me that most of the art that I showed, she absolutely hated. No, it's the truth. She would say it to me all the time. In the Blackmail exhibition, in the middle of the show, were Robert Mapplethorpe's photographs of Blackmail nudes. My mother, I don't think, ever saw the whole show, because she just would not, in her great sort of, Presbyterian black race woman way, like she just could not even get close to that, right? But, she loved me, and she had a big scrapbook of all of it, but it was a lot. So, but she often would buy me greeting cards, like mahogany greeting cards, different things, with artworks on them, and say to me, "Isn't this beautiful?" And I knew it was, she was pushing me. But, it became very profound for me, because I thought about that. I thought, what is it about us, African Americans in particular, but all people in different ways, but for me, us, that makes it so that sometimes what we want from art is that. We want beauty. We want images that do not look like the images that we have in our real lives. We want artists to do that and document either a real life for us or a fantasy of what life would be. So I set out and did an open call and received 200 artists submitted slides for this exhibition called Black Romantic, which looked at this sort of impulse for the beautiful, for the representative in black art and black artworks. This is Jonathan Knight. It was an exhibition that looked at figuration, the idea of realism as a way to capture what and who we are. It was an exhibition that looked at the idea of images. What was most profound for me about this is also an exhibition of artists who had no interest in the art world that I had spent so much time so desperately trying to create avenues for artists to get in. So that is, they existed within their own world of engagement. When I made this exhibition, I encountered many artists like James Hostin, who had full careers, showing catalogs, et cetera, but all in a world outside of my own. But I also engaged with artists who happened, in some cases, to make their artwork outside of what their real day jobs might be, right? One of the artists in the exhibition worked for the Parks Department in Kansas City, and was known in the community as an artist, but did not have an art career. This was a profound experience for me, because this was a group of artists who did not need the Studio Museum to validate their work and did not need an art world to validate their work. Their validation came from their audiences within their own communities. And in many cases, they were artists who saw values as very important to the images they made. Interesting in this image, the image of the young man with the hair around it is, the show was in 2004. That's a painting by Kehinde Wiley, one of his first. Kehinde Wiley happened to be an artist in residence at the Studio Museum at the time I was working on the exhibition. And he was just beginning to think about his own artistic path. And he was as fascinated as I was in this work. So he would spend lots of time with me looking at the images. And when I asked him if he'd like to be in the show, he actually agreed. And so what was interesting, he was not known at the time. So of course, it did not in any way strike anyone as being odd that he was in the exhibition, given that his work has now become, of course, so fully acknowledged within an art historical, canonical, radical tradition. But at that moment, he saw himself sort of looking both at the world of artists who were deeply engaged with what his project has been, creating Black images where they don't exist, but also he was looking at the ways in which he would, of course, break through several walls to create a new dialogue around that. It's Leroy Allen. This is an exhibition that also really sort of spoke about the way in which I felt that curating could create a space within a dialogue about institutional growth. So that to acknowledge on the part of an institution that there was quite potentially a space in which we could step aside from our authority and create multiple avenues to understand that authority was also sort of key and important, and much of what was written about the exhibition was that. This is Dean Mitchell, an amazing painter, fantastic painter, who has given his whole career to creating the images that he says he wants to exist in the world. That is, the images of the people around him that he feels he wants elevated through artworks. But as equal and as important as sort of working in this sort of space of questioning as a curator has been for me, it's also been the space of discovery, the space in which curatorial work is about the sort of investigation. Now, there are many esteemed historians in this room, and I am so indebted to their work because, of course, how I understand our moment is through history. But the kind of investigative work of curating in the present is really about sort of creating what might be the possibility for how we'll understand works in the future. And to that end, over the last 15 years that I've been at the museum, we've engaged in a series of exhibitions now referred to as the F shows, all with titles that begin with F, Freestyle, Frequency, Flow, and Four, which explore the notion of contemporary work by artists of African descent and seek to define what it is right now that makes that work interesting, important, significant, and what it tells us, perhaps, about where artwork and artists of African descent are going. This series of exhibitions, which are curated collectively by our curatorial teams, sort of take on a process similar to many biennials, a massive looking around the country, and in one version, Flow, around the world, and really try to put together in the best way possible a snapshot, an in-the-moment snapshot of artists and their artwork. It looks to see what the dialogues are between these artists. It looks also to see the ways in which some of them are perhaps charting conversations in their work that make us have to think about different ways to even name their processes and name what they're doing. It's a work by Rashid Johnson, a photograph, Jonathan with Hands. These exhibitions have also been our radical approach to continuing to push the art world to acknowledge the contributions of artists of African descent by presenting, in every couple of years, 28 or 30 new voices who we feel strongly should be seen in greater depth and for years moving on. This is work by Nick Cave and Frequency, the second iteration of this exhibition. This kind of work, of course, comes with it the idea that, working in the moment, there isn't the possibility always to imagine that you're defining everything as it stands. But having now, for me, the retrospective glance here, what I know is that from the first of these exhibitions in 2001, where I sort of posited that there's a way in which we could understand this group of artists as thinking about themselves as part of and against a Black arts movement as they tried to define a new one in the terms of Blackness as it exists today. This is Will Villalongo. In thinking about what that has meant, it means that we have been given an opportunity at the museum to be fully at the forefront of a kind of conversation in which artists are writing their history. That is, even the art histories that exist sometimes are not adequate for the full range of ideas and visions and voices that we are getting the opportunity to present. It is work that speaks broadly to audiences because, of course, it comes to people with itself in the most open ways, but it's also work that reveals itself over time. The third iteration of this exhibition was slightly different. It was called Flow, and it was inspired by the idea of the term coined by my friend and colleague Taye Selassie, Afropolitan, which sought to define the generation of young people either born on the continent or born to African parents elsewhere, and to understand their lives, right, as creators of African descent in the moment, and to understand that through this larger global ideal. Around this time, it's when we changed our mission at the Studio Museum to still fully be, of course, what we are, but instead of saying that we're a museum of African American art and artifacts of the African diaspora, our mission now says that we are a museum of artists of African descent, locally, nationally, and internationally. And the reason for that was really what this iteration of our F show, Flow, represented. And that is the idea that to talk about contemporary art in a global world meant that we had to understand this idea of artists of African descent in its widest possibility, in understanding it so fully as to be able to encompass the broadest range of artists who are working today. This is work by Nicholas Hobo, an artist who is based in Cape Town. These are actually canvases that are then hand-stitched, a kind of hand-stitching technique that comes out of the craft of his culture in South Africa, but then made into large-scale paintings. The exhibition was an opening, again, to this idea that in the museum's history, it had always sought to really create the space where curating could drive important cultural narratives. And in this one, the narrative was about a generation beginning to understand itself and its relationship to the continent in very different ways. The fourth iteration, and the most recent, was called Four. Play on the term four, of course, because it was the fourth iteration, but also because it sought in this moment again to think about, again, what's new. Now, I know some people get often, sort of concerned about, the way the art world is always invested in the new. For us, this is really about being able to have a particular antenna that we think artists are always most often very specifically engage with in thinking about not so much what's new in terms of what's novel, but really to think about how can something be said in a new and different way? How can we understand our history, our culture in new and different ways through art? And in Four, we really look to that as the definition. These are works by Sienna Shields, an abstract painter, but a young black woman from Alaska who is looking to think about abstract painting, the province often thought about in its most sort of muscular way through a vision of a lineage of white male artists. Also, however, Four included performance, because the performative really cannot be separated from the static object anymore in terms of our understanding of contemporary art. This is Jacoby Satterwhite, who is an artist who both works in digital animation and in performance, this in a costume he's created. And in this costume, he performed out on 125th Street to dance music, electronic music, but with his animations playing. This idea of sort of breaking through not just the idea of what art can be, but also about audience, which so many artists that we work with are so deeply interested in. How can their work speak widely and broadly? How can the walls of the museum sort of fall away? And how can art be right in the middle of the dialogues that are happening quite literally on 125th Street? For last iteration of this, we're working on the next, but with, again, the idea that this is the space in which curatorial voices can be in our public dialogue. Now, to talk about curating Black America, I do have to come back, as I did, to curators themselves and sort of understand that when we're talking about curating Black America, we also have to be talking very deeply about who's curating Black America. And what we know in our field is that in this field of museums, something that we think deeply about is the need for the broadest range of voices to tell these stories, the broadest range of voices to be the authority on how we might understand the objects. And today you've heard from some people who are creating the institutions that are really going to stand as our shining example of that. But I really press and say that in my own work, it's important to imagine that this is important everywhere, right? That the more diverse voices at the curatorial table, the more possibility we will have for engaged, radical, innovative, and inspiring work. And I think when I think about the example of Dr. Price and the really important scholarship he did, I will say that my own work is invested deeply in the idea that the legacy of our culture is the legacy that we understand through what is left. And for me, as a curator of art, my hope is that these exhibitions, those that I've shown you and those that my many colleagues are making of Black artists, really create an important legacy that allows us to understand our culture and our history in profound and powerful ways. Thank you.